Hey everybody, thanks for joining me today. Obviously, I'm not in the actual church building, but I'm still preaching today. This is gonna be a good one, so I hope you'll listen up. Hey, have you ever noticed how when you do something fun, it goes by super fast? Like when you're on vacation or you're going down a water slide, don't you wish you could just slow time down? Whenever you're doing something enjoyable, just slow it down. No, that's not how it is, right? It's the boring times that go by super slow. I remember when I was a kid sitting in elementary school, you had these giant round clocks. And as I would sit at my desk, seemed like everybody else was studying and ready, I'd stare at that clock. And I got out of school at 3:30, and that second hand would be ticking around. The minute hand would hit 3:29, and it would sit on that minute for about an hour. Hey, just elbow the person next to you if you know exactly what I'm talking about, right? You know what I'm talking about? But no, when we have fun, it's just like, boom, done super fast. It's over. Vacation over. Water slide over. Time is a weird concept. We're gonna talk about time today, especially when you think about how old some things are. It's a really interesting concept. My wife and I used to go camping often. We love being out in nature, especially when we lived in California. We would we would go visit and see the sequoia trees. Here's a photo of me inside a tree bridge. I mean, these are some giant trees. This is my wife inside our car inside a tree bridge. I mean, some of these things are massive. There was actually a sequoia tree that had fallen over, and so I just took a picture of the bottom of it because you could kind of see the circumference and how massive it was. But what I want you to notice about this picture is my wife standing beside it. Isn't that astounding? Now, how old are these sequoia trees? According to the National Park Service, 3,500 years old or more. Now, Abraham, who was a father of the Jewish nation, he lived about 1800 BC. So some of these trees were being planted as the nation of Israel was beginning. Just think about that. Abraham is walking, and from Abraham comes Isaac and Jacob, who is Israel, and then the 12 tribes of Israel. And that was a long time ago. Let me take you back before you were born, right? Before Jesus died, before Israel, before trees, before earth, before the sun and moon, back, far, far back, aren't we? Right? Even that length of time tells us very little about the concept of eternity. Write this down. Comprehending eternity completely is impossible. The best we do is imagine it and know it's beyond that. Let's compare the water slide to the life of a giant sequoia tree. I mean, obviously, the length of time it takes to go down a water slide is just seconds, but a sequoia tree's lived for 3,500 years. That's incredible. But now, let's compare the lifespan of a giant sequoia to eternity. How should we compare the lifespan of a giant sequoia to eternity? I mean, how can we do that? Honestly, it's just stupid to even try. We can't explain that. We can barely explain how old the trees are. You try to think back in your life, you're 20, 30, 80, 90 years old. You try to think back before you were born, 100, 200, 500 years, and it's like hard to comprehend. Eternity? You can't explain eternity in concepts of time because eternity is before time. It's also after time, even though it doesn't even make sense. In the Bible, Psalm chapter 90, this is what we're talking about today. It says, before the mountains were born, or you brought forth the earth and the world, from everlasting to everlasting, you are God. Let's write this down. God has the incommunicable attribute of being eternal. God is everlasting. We are not everlasting. We will exist forever, but there was a moment in time where we did not exist. But the concept is this: time does not limit God. Time does not limit God. Say that with me. Time does not limit God. Come on, say it again. Time does not limit God. The writer of Psalm 90 starts, he says, before the mountains. I started with water slides and giant sequoias, but it's the same idea, right? Before all of that, before God brought forth the earth, what was before that? Nothing. It says from everlasting to everlasting, you are God. All right, so think about this. Let's make arrow go this way and an arrow go that way. This is representing eternity. This is so cool. I want you to think about this. Write it down. The word everlasting in Hebrew, because this part of the Bible was written in Hebrew, literally means the vanishing point. Peering until you can't see. It just disappears. It's gone in both directions. Whew. The word's root means that which is hidden. And how does the writer of this psalm try to describe the nature of God? He says, from one hidden vanishing point all the way to the other hidden vanishing point, you are God. Try to comprehend how long God has existed. Well, before the tree, before the mountain, before the earth, until it all vanishes, okay? Go way back. And then go the other direction, all the way through the future, until it all vanishes. Now that's all I can even try to comprehend. And I know that God is there the whole time. And our brains should have just melted. There are dozens of Bible verses trying to talk about God being outside of time. When the Bible was written, it was written in mainly Greek and Hebrew. And it's as if though they use every Greek and Hebrew word they could use to describe this. You know, it's kind of like if we were to say outer space is more than a mile in the sky. Well, yeah, I mean, that's true, but that hardly adequately describes the vastness of outer space, right? Like saying it's more than a mile in the sky is like, well, yeah, that's true. And well, the same thing. In Hebrew and Greek language, they didn't have words to adequately describe the vastness of God's eternity. So they just said, he went from a vanishing point to another vanishing point. Like there wasn't a word that meant all eternity outside of time. They're trying to get as much out of every word as they can. So when you describe God being outside of time, we should do the same thing. Try to get as much out of this as we can. Try to explain clearly that God is from everlasting to everlasting, beyond time. We are limited by time. Everything we do is inside time. We can't redo moments. We can't see ahead. Though we can remember, we can't see in the past. Even if we were able to travel 100 times the speed of light and then turn around, we could see light that was reflected from the past, and we could see things that had happened back because we were seeing a reflection of the past, but we're not actually looking into the past itself. You can't interact with it. We move from one direction down the timeline to the next moment. And we experience one moment at a time. But for God, this is all much more fluid. Elihu in the book of Job, chapter 36, said this, "How great is God? Beyond our understanding, the number of his years is past finding out." Think about that verse. That phrase, finding out, is from Hebrew. It literally means deliberation, right? The number of God's years are beyond deliberation. You can't even discuss it, can't even think about it, can't argue about it or investigate it. Why? Because according to Psalm 90, the number of his years is a misnomer. It's everlasting, lasting forever in both directions. God's years aren't numbered because God has no years. Sometimes when describing what God is like, it's easier to say what he's not instead of what he is. So let's write this down. Understanding God's eternal nature. God has no beginning. Would you say God has no beginning with me? Come on. God has no beginning. Come on, everybody, say it again. God has no beginning. I want to take a little walk. So walk with me now. We're going to go back into your past. We're going to go past your teen years. We're going to go past your elementary school years. We're going to go all the way to the moment that you were born or the moment you were conceived, although we're not going to show that on video, right? We're just going to, okay, now, what is before you for you? I mean, I know there was stuff that happened before you, but from your perspective, what comes before you? What would it be like if you were never born? Our only concept is then I wouldn't exist. Yeah, that would be kind of bad. But this is not the way it is for God, right? Without birth, I have no existence. But God is different than that. God actually existed before our time existed. God is the one who invented time. To have God step into this nothingness isn't a strange thing for God because existence is part of God's nature, a part of needing anything, including a beginning. God didn't need a beginning. God didn't need time. God can go back to the beginning before time existed, and he still was. What did Psalm 90 say? Before the mountains were born, or you brought forth the earth and the world, from everlasting, it's way before time began, to everlasting, that's way beyond anything we can comprehend. you are God. God didn't begin to be. God was. People ask, well, where did God come from? Because nothing can't produce something, right? If you have nothing, you can't make something. So where did God come from? God always was. There wasn't a before God. But even saying that he always was doesn't quite get it, because always implies there was time for trillions of years before now and that God was there, but there wasn't time. There just was God. Time was not, God was. That's why God, when Moses asks him for his name, says, I am. God is. Actually, it's interesting, using this logic, you can prove God exists. This is one of my favorite philosophical arguments. It's called the Kalam cosmological argument, and we made a video about it a number of years ago, and I got no beard. And so my 12-year-old self shot a video about how to prove God's existence, thinking about time. It's easier to believe in something if you can see it or feel it, because if you can see it and feel it, you know it's real. But if God's invisible, if he cannot be seen, tasted, touched, smelled, or heard by humans, how do we know God exists at all? The question is, does God exist? Today, we're examining the Kalam cosmological argument. It's an argument for the existence of God, and basically, it goes something like this. Number one says, whatever has a beginning to its existence must have a cause. Number two says, the universe began to exist. Now, number three should therefore say, the universe has a cause, a creator. Now, when well-thinking philosophers speak of this argument, it's accepted as logically valid, which means that the argument makes sense. If 1 and 2 are true, then 3 must be true. The only way to defeat this proof for God is to deny number 1 or deny number 2. So let's look at these individually. Number 1 says that whatever has a beginning to its existence must have a cause. Now in metaphysics, which we all love, this is known as the law of causality. Nothing cannot produce something. It should be obvious that if something began to exist, something must have caused it to exist.
Oh. Where did that come from?
Nowhere. It just popped into existence right in front of your face.
More like the small of my back.
This is true for anything, from an apple, an apple tree, to a bug, mommy and daddy bug, a car, Henry Ford, your sibling, yeah, you don't want to think about that, but they had a cause too. It doesn't mean that there's a reason for them to exist, only that something caused them to exist. Some people argue that this proves there's no God, because if everything needed a cause to exist, what caused God? They say God must have been self-caused, which is impossible, because something cannot come from nothing. You can't cause yourself to exist, therefore God cannot exist. But this is a mistake. The argument doesn't say everything has a cause. It says whatever has a beginning to its existence must have a cause. Since God had no beginning, he needed no cause. Therefore, God's not a self-caused being. God exists outside of time. He never began to exist. God is a non-caused being. So a simple look at line number 1 allows us to see that it's true. Whatever has a beginning to its existence must have a cause. Line 2 is a bit more tricky. It sounds simple enough though. The universe began to exist. At some point, if you're a young earther, maybe 6,000, 10,000 years ago, maybe if you're an old earther, 15 billion years ago, 14.5 billion years ago, whatever, the universe came into existence. Before it came into existence, there was nothing. In order to disprove number 2, some scientists and philosophers have argued that the universe is eternal. It has always existed and had no beginning. But there's 2 types of reasons why we know the universe had to have a beginning. The first one is a philosophical reason, and the second is a scientific reason. Let's start by using logic. If you're trying to deny number 2, you would argue that the universe did not have a beginning. This would mean it was infinite. Now, before we can tackle this issue, we have to understand what infinite really is. it isn't something that keeps growing and getting bigger. Mathematicians will tell you very clearly that infinite is not a specific number, but rather something that in a sense is complete. Dictionary.com gives a definition that says this: infinite is existing beyond or being greater than any arbitrarily large value. No matter how high you counted or how far you walked, you could never reach infinity. You could theoretically count forever, but your number still began at 0 and can be measured by adding 1 over and over and over until you get there. With infinity, however, this is not the case. Stop counting, because infinity plus 1 equals infinity. Infinity minus 1 is still infinity. You cannot take away or add to infinity because it's the complete whole value. Imagine that you're tired and you tried walking somewhere. You're on the line of infinity. After walking for 5 minutes, you're even more tired, but you have to go faster. Well, in one sense, you're 5 minutes closer, but in another sense, you're still forever away because you can never reach the end of infinity. Although infinity is not a circle, it really contains everything that exists. Let's use a circle as an example. This dot is trying to travel over infinity. How long would it take to spin before it reached infinity? If it ran around for 10 years, how much more would it have to go to reach the end of infinity? Well, forever. It couldn't reach the end. How much more would it have to go to be halfway to infinity? It could never even get halfway because infinite is always more than it's done. Imagine now that there's a point in the infinite circle that the dot is chasing, a square. How far away are these 2 points? Now remember, this isn't really a circle, it's a representation of infinity. While it looks like they may be just a few inches apart, they're actually infinitely far apart. How long would it take the dot to reach the end, or even halfway to the square? Well, because infinity always continues, the dot could never even reach another point closer to the square because they're separated by an infinite amount of space. Traveling more quickly won't get him there. Traveling further won't get him there. It doesn't matter. He's always infinitely far away. If the universe was infinite, we never would have reached the point where you came into existence because you are still an infinite number of years away from your existence. No matter how long we waited, the universe would still never get to the point where you or me exist. And that's a really sad thing. So logically, the universe cannot have been infinite, or we would never have come into existence. We would not have come to the place and time where we exist. The second reason we know the universe is not eternal is because of science. The second law of thermodynamics tells us in very simple terms, everything in a closed system runs down. Now, on a personal level, we understand that unless you take your car to a mechanic, it will eventually break down. Hot food eventually gets cold, and batteries in your remote control will someday run out of power.
Stupid batteries.
Now, this is on a large scale too. Stars eventually die, black holes eat up solar systems. This is going down, man. And believe it or not, the entire universe is slowly cooling down. Scientists have measured and noted that in 10 to the 30 years, that's trillions and trillions of years from now, the universe will be 90% dead stars. Our sun won't exist. 9% of our universe will be gigantic black holes, preparing to eat the rest of the universe. And 1% will be simple matter like hydrogen. Now, if you trust quantum mechanics, like we all do.
Do you believe in quantum mechanics?
Well, yeah, of course I do. You just have to know how to control it.
Quantum mechanics teaches that in 10 to 100 years, black holes will even dissipate. The entire universe will be a giant bubble of gas, like ether in a Pepsi bottle, and it will never change from this state of nothingness. Now, this won't happen for trillions upon trillions of years, but if the universe has always existed, then technically it should have cooled off a long time ago because trillions and trillions of years would have gone by trillions and trillions of years ago. You get it? This black hole, this nothingness the universe is headed towards, it would have happened a long time ago if the universe was infinitely old. If the universe was infinitely old, according to the second law of thermodynamics, we would have run out of energy many years before we got here. Now, let's go ahead and review the Kalam cosmological argument and plug in what you know about these pieces of information. Number one, whatever has a beginning to its existence must have a cause. It's true. Number two, the universe began to exist. That's true. Therefore, the universe has a cause, a creator. Since the universe is everything that we know that exists, the very thing that caused it to exist must be the creator, God, something, someone outside of the universe. And that is the Kalam cosmological argument. Wasn't that a great video? Way to prove God exists. But you know what? In fact, this is an important thing to understand about God's eternal nature that we're talking about today. We are created by God, but it was just us that was created, right? Not God. Let's write it down. Understanding God's eternal nature, time was created by God and is dependent on Him for existence. That's a really cool thing to think about. Time is dependent on God for existence. Just as you need air to breathe and water to drink, or you would die, time requires God creating it. And time requires God continuing to sustain it. Psalm 90 again, read it out loud with me this time. Before the mountains were born, or you brought forth the earth and the... Come on, read it out loud, right? Come on, start at the beginning. Before the mountains were born, or you brought forth the earth and the world, from everlasting to everlasting, you are God. That's everlasting, all right? That's what from everlasting to everlasting, you are God means. It means from what is hidden, what we cannot see outside of time, from a vanishing point, all the way to the other vanishing point in Hebrew. What's the vanishing point? Time ending. The end of time. I want to show you a very cool picture, but you're going to have to put on your thinking caps for just a minute, okay? This is called Euclidean space. All right, it's a 3 physical dimension graphic. It's a pretty good graphic. But what about time? Time is the 4th dimension. Physics tells us that matter and time and space must all occur together. If there is no matter, there can be no space or time either. Now, listen to Psalm 90 again. It says, God brought forth the earth. I find this interesting. We know that matter and time need each other to exist. Time is as fluid for God as dimensions and matter can be. So here's a small example. We're stuck moving forward, but we can slow it down. Did you know that? It's called time dilation. As you approach the speed of light, time actually slows down. Satellites for GPS systems are actually 38 microseconds per day slower than your clock on Earth, because they travel that much closer to the speed of light. Time isn't some powerful force that is uncontrollable. We actually kind of mess with it. So God created the universe, including time. And if we can affect things and change the amount of time it takes us to measure a second, then don't you think God is in complete control of that? Before God created the universe, there was no time. Not talking about succession, all right? Philosophers debate what the heck that means and whether or not you can have existence without succession one moment after the next, but we know from theology, philosophy, and physics, time was created. Time, therefore, depends on God. You see people on Facebook all the time saying things like, time is just a made-up construct. Well, it's not. It exists. It's real. But this leads us to understand a few things about how God sees time. Let's write this down. Understanding God's eternal nature. Time does not limit God's knowledge or His passion about events in time. If you think about the fact that God exists beyond the vanishing point to beyond the vanishing point, you realize that since God is outside of time, He must know everything. No wonder prophets can exist. God can speak to a man and say, hey, this is going to happen in 1,000 years, and that man can tell you what God said because God can see it because He doesn't exist within time. Of course God can say what's going to happen 1,000 years from now. Let's write this down. Understanding God's eternal nature. God has no past. All events are current. This is another really cool scenario that we can understand because of God's eternal nature. God has no past. Now think about that. And let your head earthquake at that thought. God has no past. We have a past. Each of these words you hear from my voice are now in the past. They leave, you hear them, they're done. But God has no such things. There is no was for God. He does not say, I did that back then, but I could hardly do that now. I'm a little older. No, he doesn't have a past. It's all now. Actually, write this down. Understanding God's eternal nature. God has no future. Everything is now. God's not anticipating events. The year 2012 or 3012 or 1000 or 2018 are no more in the future or in the past than the year 800 BC or 1 million BC or 1 million years from now, at least from God's perspective, right? Eternity could kind of be compared to someone floating in a tube around a never-ending river. Time moves on, but eternity just keeps going. And that's kind of good. But it still implies that God is at certain places at certain times. So I don't like that analogy very much. It's like God's moving with time. It's just very slow for him. But God is not moving with time. It's much more like this. I like the idea of thinking about God kind of like inside a snow globe. Each glimmering fleck is a moment in time. Some in the past, some in the future, some way back in the past. God sees all pieces, past, present, future, equally. He experiences all of them here. Or better yet, God's not on the inside of the snow globe. God is the one holding it. God is outside of time, so God's seeing all of these things inside this snow globe. Every moment, your past, your present, your future, and he's holding them in his hand because he is from everlasting to everlasting. He is not constrained by any of this. But then the question is, if there's no past or future for God, what does that imply? Does God get bored? Is he uninterested because like, yeah, I've been watching this for 10 billion years. Like, is there no anticipation, no emotion for God? No, that's not true. Let's write this down. Understanding God's eternal nature. God sees all times equally vividly. Equally vividly. Our memories fade as we get further away. The present is always the most vivid for us. But the past isn't as vivid. You know how a smell can bring back the memory of Grandma's house? When I say that, some of you can actually smell your grandma's house. All of a sudden, like you're vividly in Grandma's kitchen. You're eating the cookies she used to make. Why is it like that? Because our memories are tied to our senses, and when our senses fire, boom, it becomes vivid for us. Since God is timeless, every event is equally vivid all the time to God. All the time. We would be overwhelmed with this sense, but God understands them all, right? We couldn't handle 20 billion memories from all the billions of people all at the same time, but all events from 1 million years ago to today to 1,000 years from now, God knows them all. All. 2 Peter 3:8 says, with the Lord, a day is like 1,000 years, and 1,000 years are like a day. We understand that 1,000 years are like a day, okay? Like for God, okay, 1,000 years goes by really fast. And if we incorrectly state, God has been around a long time, we can say, no, 1,000 years is nothing to him. He's lived 1 billion, okay? But the purpose of that verse isn't just to say, oh yeah, you know, that 1,000 years is nothing for God. It's to show that all time is equally vivid to God. It goes the other way too. It didn't just say that 1,000 years goes by fast. It said a day is like 1,000 years. Think even harder about that. 1 day for God is just like 1,000 years for him. That is a long day. That means this moment in time, right now, for God, this moment existed vividly to him from the moment he created until the end of time. It's happening right now. Jesus is crucified right now. The flood is happening right now. Armageddon, he sees it right now. You know what a prism is, right? We kind of talked about this earlier in the series, if you're watching this as a series. A prism separates one beam of light into a rainbow of light so we can see all the different aspects or colors at different times. It's as if time is a prism for us. Time exists, but we're passing through one piece at a time. But God experiences all of them all the time. As we move through time, the different colors, we experience things. So when we do evil, we see the angry, just part of God. When we do good, we see the happy part of God. This means that your sin that you did last week, God sees it equally vividly right now as He did last week. But your salvation and your love for Him, He sees it right now. When you're sinning right now, and because you believe in Jesus Christ, you're going to repent from it tomorrow. He sees that right now. Isaiah 59, verse 12 says, "For our offenses are many in your sight, and our sins testify against us." Listen, our offenses are ever with us, all the time. They're always with us. It's not just like you're carrying a backpack and God never, ever is going to let you forget about it. No, ever with us means like, I can't say, "Oh God, I'm so much better than another person," because God sees your sin from 20 years ago today. He sees it right now. But here's the big deal. Even though God sees it all and He sees it right now, He knows we're still in time, and He brought you here to see this today. That's why it's important to understand that when God saw your sin billions of years ago, He created a plan that Jesus would enter into time at a specific time, that Jesus would go to the cross, take your sins on His shoulders, that God would punish Him for your sin, He would die and rise from the dead. And He still promises that anyone who asks for forgiveness and believes that Jesus Christ lived, died, and rose from the dead will have forgiveness. God has known from before time that you would be here to hear this. He allowed you, He brought you here because He loves you. So let's get practical for a minute. You can write this down. Number one, God knows the future, and therefore He knows what He is doing in my life. All right, don't buy the lie that things are out of control for God, that God doesn't know what's going to happen. You don't have to worry about anything. God knows exactly where He's taking you because He's already seen your tomorrow. In fact, God is already there right now, taking care of you right now. Remember the snow globe, right? He sees that fleck. He's already determined it and seen it, and He knows what's going to happen. We only have a choice to follow the timeless God or to reject the timeless God. In fact, I want you to think back to a problem that you had. A crisis that you went through that is now resolved. Okay, think about one. Go ahead, think about it. A time that you thought, this is unfixable. I'll never get past it. Think about a moment like that. A time where you now see how God has worked it out. How God helped you become who you are because of that moment that you thought would never get through. That sort of perspective where you go, yeah, you know what? Now I see what God was doing. Now I see that God was able to work it out. That sort of perspective is the perspective God has on your current problems. He knows what you're going through, and He knows how it's going to work out. He is the timeless God. Romans 8:28 says, "We know that in all things, God works for the good of those who love Him, who've been called according to His purpose." Did you hear that? In all things, even your screw-ups, God works for the good of those who love Him. If you love Him, He sees what's going to happen tomorrow. He sees how He's going to work it out. He's going to use it for your benefit. How do we know this? We know it because God isn't just taking His best guess at what's going to happen. He's using His power and His knowledge to promise you that He is going to work it out. Don't just look at verse 28. Look at verse 29, the verse right after it. Read both of them. It says, "We know that in all things God works for the good of those who love Him, who have been called according to His purpose, because those God foreknew," all right? A long time ago, God already knew you. Those God foreknew, He predestined, right? He made a choice that you would be conformed to the image of His Son. Right? God already determined a long time ago when He saw your sin, millions of years in the future, He said, I'm going to find that person. They're going to believe in Me and they're going to trust Me, so I'm going to help them become the person I want them to become. If you're a believer, God is using your experiences to make you more like Jesus, to make you what He designed you to be. Don't buy the lie that you're simply stuck. Here's another perspective. Write this down. Good perspective to have. My life is short compared to where I'll spend eternity. We always exist in time, and we will always exist in time. We'll have sequence, this moment, then the next moment, but we will find what it means to be everlasting. And some people are going to be everlasting, lasting forever in heaven or on the new earth with God. And some people are going to be lasting forever in hell apart from God's blessings. We act like time, these 80 years, are the most important thing ever. People think, oh, I got to enjoy this life. If I don't enjoy this life, it's all wasted. But that is not true. This life, friends, it is going away. You live for 80 years, you think that's a long time. It is nothing, because you're either going to heaven or you are going to hell, and you are going to go there for 80 years plus 80 years plus 100 years plus 1,000 years plus 1,000,000 years plus 1,000,000,000 plus 1,000,000,000,000 plus... Keep going. So what do you do with these small 80 years? You risk your finances for God and His people. You risk your reputation for God and help people know Him. You risk your life for God, your very life. And why not? Maybe instead of living to 80, you only live to 50 or 40, or maybe you only live to 20. But so what? What is the difference between living to 20 years and living 80 years compared to eternity? It's a very small difference. It's nothing. Risk your life. Risk everything to follow God. Romans 8:18 says, I consider that our present sufferings are not worth comparing with the glory that will be revealed in us. That means when you are in the presence of God, when Jesus returns and we are experiencing all that God has for us as believers, we're going to look back at the worst of the worst that we went through on earth, and we're going to say, that was nothing compared to this. This is awesome. This is everlasting life, man. This is good. Well, isn't this life important, though? Am I saying it's not important? No. This life is very important. Check out the next point and write it down. Any time I treat something in this life with more importance than preparation for my next life, I am wasting my time. Nothing you do for God is a waste. Nothing. All right, I want you to shout out the word nothing, okay? Nothing you do for God is a waste. Say it. Nothing. Whatever you gained for heavenly rewards will last forever. Say forever. Forever. Right? Now we know that means a long time. But rust is going to eat your nice car in this life. Taxes are going to take your money in this life. I know you know that. Sickness will take your life. And even that awesome water park, it is going away. Before it's taken from us, I say we invest it in eternity where we won't lose it. The giant sequoia trees, they live today. They lived 1,000 years ago when the church was fighting for its life. 2,000 years ago when Jesus walked the earth. When Moses received the 10 commandments, the sequoia trees were growing. When Abraham was walking on earth, those trees were being planted or growing. But they are saplings. Saplings compared to eternity. God is bigger than all time. He created time. He sees the future, He sees the past, and He has wisely asked us to invest this limited amount of time we have on earth for a giant reward for everlasting life. So stop wasting your time with stuff that doesn't